Alright guys, so we are going to start off with our first lesson for evolution. And so we're actually going to have several different lessons on evolution. And really we kind of started it off yesterday with the making of a theory. And what I really like about that video is it kind of shows you a little more insight into Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, both of these guys came up with the ideas of natural selection, and as you saw in the video, Darwin really had it first, but Alfred Russel Wallace, by doing his own studies in different areas of the world, kind of came up with the same conclusion. Now, what they did was kind of propose a mechanism for evolution. They did not propose evolution for the very first time, so there are some other thoughts about organisms changing or evolving before Darwin and Wallace. But I really like that video because it kind of gives you the insight of how those ideas were developed over time and how they were kind of revolutionary whenever these gentlemen lived. And so what evolution is in general is a change in the genetic makeup of a species over time. It's a change over time, that's it. And so Darwin and Wallace did not propose the idea of evolution. They proposed a way in which this change could happen. And we'll take a look at that change in this lesson today. I know evolution can be a bit of a trigger word. It is something that, in my opinion, is often used incorrectly. There are different levels of evolution, and so I think sometimes when people just relate everything to the one word, it can be a bit confusing. Now, I want to tell you again, and I probably mentioned this first semester, but this is a major theme in biology. Pretty much all things in biology can be explained through evolution in some form or fashion. So it's definitely something that we have to talk about. Now, there are areas of evolution that can be conflicting. And so I just want to let you know that as a biology teacher, we are trying to teach you biology concepts and not trying to change your own personal belief system. You are entitled to your beliefs. All I'm asking you as your teacher is that you learn about these evolutionary concepts. Much of what we will talk about is not controversial. There's really nothing that would conflict with beliefs of any type, but there are some areas that are possibly going to question some religious ideals, and that's okay. Once again, I'm not trying to tell you what you need to believe personally, just saying this is what biology says. As your teacher and as the proctors that you have in the room, it is not our job to tell you what we believe. So we won't tell you where we stand on the ideas. We're just merely here to present the biological side of it. Now, in terms of the biological side, evolution, like I said, can pretty much help explain just about everything in biology, especially when we look at biodiversity, of how do we have all of these differences of life across the globe. Much of that can be explained through the process of evolution. Now, something that's critical to understand is that you, as an individual, cannot evolve, okay? A single tortoise cannot evolve. A single fish cannot evolve. It is the group. It is a population that evolves. Now, before Darwin and Wallace, there was an idea that was thrown around by John Baptiste Lamarck. And I want you to understand that it was not correct. But this was one of those earlier ideals of evolution and how organisms could change. And what he said was that organisms could acquire traits. Now, what this means is within their lifetime, they could gain or change the traits that they had, either through use or disuse or through environmental pressures. And then, according to Lamarck, once an individual organism acquired these traits, they would then be able to pass that trait down to their offspring. And like I said, this is not right. This is wrong. Okay, but this was an idea that preceded Darwin's concept of natural selection. And essentially, it seems kind of ridiculous to us now, but an example of Lamarck's ideas was that as the giraffes would stretch to reach the leaves, their necks would get longer, and then they could pass those longer necks on to their babies. Now, according to Darwin's ideas of natural selection, the ones that were shorter weren't able to eat, and so they would die. And then what would happen is the ones with longer necks would survive better, and that would lead to more giraffes with longer necks. And so this is the more acceptable form Like I said, Lamarck is not correct. So like he had the idea that if a person was strong from their work, that they could then pass that strength and extra muscle tone on to their kids. And that's just really not the way it works, okay? All right, so what we're going to focus on in this lesson is microevolution. And this is going to be an area that, in my opinion, there really is no debate. Okay, this is observable. We see this in labs. We see this in populations with our own eyes. We even see this in our own population. Okay, so microevolution are the small scale changes in allele frequencies. So just to kind of review, remember that alleles are the different forms of a gene, like the capital A or the lowercase a. And so if you just have an increase in one allele and a decrease in the other allele, then microevolution has occurred. And this isn't necessarily something that you would automatically see in the population because it is at that molecular level. So we're not talking about making a new organism here. We're just talking about increasing or decreasing allele frequencies in a population. And so the study of this is called population genetics. And so you can look at those genetic changes in populations, and there's mathematical formulas that go along with it. But essentially, different forces can change those allele frequencies over time. And that's really all microevolution is. And so when you're studying a population and their genetics, you're looking at their gene pool, which is all of the alleles that are possible in that population. Now, what can happen over time is that if you have a really beneficial allele, it could become fixed. It's going to stay in that population. Or you could have alleles that are detrimental. They aren't good. They don't necessarily improve survival. And so what could happen is those particular alleles over time could be eliminated from the population. Or you could even have new alleles introduced by mutation. And so just population genetics is kind of studying all of these changes that could occur to a population's gene pool. Now we're going to look at 5 different mechanisms of microevolution. So these are all the ways that allele frequencies could change in a population. Now probably the most well-known and the one that you think of is what we saw like in the video with Darwin and Wallace, and that's the idea of natural selection. But I want you to understand it is not the only way that a population can change. It is a major way. It is definitely a mechanism that we see often with selection and reproduction. But as you can see, there are other mechanisms that could lead to those allele frequency changes. So we're going to go through each of these 5, starting with natural selection. And this is essentially survival of the fittest. This is what we commonly call it. And this is where you have certain characteristics are going to give organisms within a population an advantage. And so what will happen is certain characteristics will lead to better survival and reproduction. And this is what we call differential reproductive success. So essentially, individuals with certain traits are going to survive better and reproduce better than other individuals that do not have those traits. And that is what will lead to a change in the population because the alleles will be passed on in different proportions. The alleles that provided for that beneficial characteristic are most likely going to increase in the population, whereas those alleles that did not provide that advantage will most likely decrease in the population. And so natural selection kind of explains how adaptations arise. So how do we see camouflage? How do we see the adaptations of the predators? Or how do we see the adaptations of the prey? Well, these adaptations arise through this process of natural selection where these traits that allow for better fitness, which is reproductive success, the traits that allow for higher fitness will lead to these adaptations where the traits will match the environment. Now, in order for natural selection to occur, there are kind of 4 conditions or 4 kind of main principles that are going to be at work in the population. Number 1 is variation. If every organism is the same, then none of them will have a reproductive advantage. So the key is you have to have variation in a population. And these are just those differences that you see. If you just take a look at the students in your classroom, you can see variation in humans, different heights, different hair colors, different skin colors, different talents and abilities. There's lots of variation just in the room that you're sitting in. And so every population, aside from those that are asexual, every population that reproduces sexually is going to most likely have a high amount of variation. And that can be in physical traits, that can be in behavioral traits. Now, even those that produce asexually could get variation through mutations. So we could have random mutation, or we could also have genetic recombination, which is like crossing over an independent assortment. But in order for natural selection to work, you have to have variation among your population. That is what's going to create individuals that have an advantage over other individuals. Now, the second thing is overproduction, and essentially this is going to be death. And this is kind of sad to think about, but it's the reality in nature, and that more organisms are going to be produced and can actually survive. And that is going to ultimately relate to the next one, which is competition. Okay, if there's plenty of resources, there's no reason to have an advantage. There's no reason to have a higher fitness. And so we know that in nature, rarely is there no competition. So by having too many organisms and having competition, that is going to favor certain traits. And then the last thing is just that relationship between fitness and survival. The idea that organisms that have a higher fitness are more likely to survive and reproduce. Now, when we're looking at natural selection in a population, there's different types of genetic traits. Some of our genetic traits are what we call qualitative characters, and these qualitative are pretty much your single gene traits, the ones where it's a this or a that situation. So this over here would be an example of a qualitative character. You either have tall plants or you have short plants. You either have a widow's peak or you don't have a widow's peak. You either have attached earlobes or you don't have attached earlobes. The pea plants either had purple flowers or white flowers. These are examples of qualitative characters. And if you had natural selection working on these, essentially, whichever phenotype was favored, you would most likely see an increase in those alleles and a decrease in the other alleles. Now, most of our traits are what we call quantitative characters. And this is where they vary along a continuum. And this is the result of traits that are controlled by more than one gene. They're polygenic. And so what we get is this range of phenotypes. And so the way natural selection acts on these types of traits is a little bit differently. In this case, we're going to see a change in distribution along that continuum. So when we have these kind of range of phenotypes, so here we have different colors of mice. You could have lightest to darkest, you could have shortest to tallest, you could have smallest to biggest, whatever it is. In this case, we're going to have a range. And so depending on what is favored in that particular ecosystem, that would affect the type of selection that we will see. So one type you could see is directional, and this is where one extreme is favored. So here we see that the mice on this end of the spectrum, they must blend in better, and so over time we see a shift toward one direction of that spectrum. And that could go either direction, okay, depends on the environment. Now, disruptive selection, this is where the two extremes are favored. So maybe there's two different types of rocks or land here, and so the ones on this end are favored and the ones in this end are favored, but the ones in the middle, they stand out. And so what we see is this disruption, okay? We see this increase on either end of the spectrum and a decrease in the middle. And then the third type is stabilizing. This is where the middle phenotype is favored. So when the middle is favored, we see a decrease in those extremes and an increase in the middle, okay? And so this is where the mid-range is favored. All right, the second mechanism that we're going to take a look at are mutations. And we know, hopefully, that mutations are just changes to DNA. Now, when it comes to mutations, sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're neutral. It just depends on the mutation, it depends on the gene, it depends on where it is. And so the thing with mutations, like we mentioned earlier, is it can help maintain variation. Now, another thing that mutations can do is they can essentially introduce new alleles into the population, and the more alleles you have, the more variation you have. So mutations play a role in the variation within populations and possibly introducing new traits or new alleles. A third mechanism for microevolution is genetic drift. And I want you to always connect drift with this word right here, random. Think of randomly drifting in the ocean, okay? So with natural selection, the key was fitness, okay? That organisms that were more fit had a greater advantage and were more likely to survive and reproduce. Well, here, it's just literally a random thing. It's really more about luck than it is fitness. And so sometimes random things happen, okay? So we have two examples of genetic drift. We have the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. The founder effect is where a small group becomes isolated. Maybe they're doing habitat fragmentation in the rainforest or something like that. But you have an original population where when smaller groups get isolated, they may not fully represent the original group. So you could see that from this original population, as these became isolated, there were changes to that gene pool. Obviously, the allele frequencies changed. Now, the same thing happens with bottleneck, except for it's more about a survivorship. So this is where they found a new colony or something. This is where you have some kind of natural disaster or major event that leads to only a few survivors. The ones that survive may have just been due to luck and not fitness. Maybe they were in the right place at the right time, and the other ones were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the survivors may not fully represent that original population. All right, another mechanism for microevolution is gene flow. And the word you need to connect to this one is migration. So for natural selection, it was all about fitness. For genetic drift, it was all about random changes. And for gene flow, it's all about migration. As organisms move into or out of a population, they are going to introduce or remove alleles, okay? And as we see migration and gene flow, a lot of times we see populations becoming more similar rather than more different. All right, and then the very last mechanism of microevolution is mating that is not random. Essentially, random mating is where there's no selection whatsoever. You are going to maintain the genes in the gene pool. You see random mating in some populations, like maybe where the female fish lays the eggs and then the males just release the sperm in the water. There is no selection as to who the father of the baby fish would be. In a lot of populations, we see non-random mating, and this is where there's some type of selection process. Maybe the females are picking the strongest males or the brightest colors or something along those lines. And anytime you have like sexual reproduction where there is non-random mating, what you'll see is that certain traits and genes will be favored, and that can shift the genotype frequencies that are being passed on over time. And so those are going to be the 5 different mechanisms for microevolution, or those small changes. And once again, each one kind of has its own role. Natural selection is not the only way. Now, something else I want to talk about in this lesson is the Hardy-Weinberg principle. Sometimes it's called the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, same thing. But this is about a concept known as genetic equilibrium. Okay, so according to Hardy-Weinberg, a population's frequencies will be stable, or they will be the same. And that's what genetic equilibrium is. Now, if a population were in genetic equilibrium, that means they are not evolving. That means the allele frequencies are not changing. Now, as long as there weren't evolutionary forces like the ones we talked about acting on the population could essentially maintain those allele frequencies generation after generation after generation. Now, the idea of maintaining genetic equilibrium is not realistic, because in order to maintain equilibrium, there are certain conditions that must be met. In fact, there are 5. The first condition is that there can be no mutations in the population. Now, think about it. Do we have control over mutations? Not really. They just happen randomly. The second thing is that there would have to be random mating. That means that there would and could not be any selection in the mates. The females would not choose certain males, and the males would not choose certain females. There are populations that do that, but not a whole lot. The third condition is there can be no natural selection. There can be no fitness. There can be no overproduction and selection and all those things. There has to be an incredibly large population, and you can't have any of those random changes, and there can be no gene flow. So here's the deal. In a natural population, the possibility of meeting all 5 of these criteria is very unlikely. And so the whole idea behind equilibrium is that if you're not in equilibrium, you're changing, okay? So the whole concept of Hardy-Weinberg is not to say that populations don't change. It's to say that they will not change only if these conditions are met. And that likelihood is very, very, very small, if not impossible, okay? All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in this lesson are some different areas of evidence for evolution. And I'm sure we're going to have some kind of activity that goes along with this. But number 1 is fossil record. The fossil record is essentially a timeline buried in the rocks, and it can show older fossils to newer fossils. It can show the changes in organisms over time. We can use different dating methods. There's relative dating where we date them by the layers. There's radioactive dating where we use isotopes to kind of give them a more accurate type of age. But essentially we can kind of recreate this evolutionary timeline. Now, of course, not every organism has been preserved in the fossil record, but we can see changes over time in organisms just by observing this fossil record. Another area of evidence is anatomical evidence, and this is looking at anatomy of organisms. A lot of times students struggle with these vocabulary words, and so we want to take a look at what they mean. So when we look at evolutionary relationships, one of the main things we study are homologies. Now remember that homo means the same. And so homologous structures are organism structures that are the same, and the reason is because they are related. Okay, so homologous structures show common ancestry. Okay, they show that organisms are related to each other because they have similar structures. And I'm going to show you an example here in a second. Here's a very brief one. The rat arm and the bat wing have similar structures. Now, do they do the same things? Nope, they do not. But they do have a very similar bone structure, and that would suggest that they share a common ancestor and that they are related. Another type of anatomical structure are vestigial, and vestigial are remnants. These are going to be things that an organism has but they don't use anymore. Things like our wisdom teeth. We have a tailbone but no tail. There are little fingers in a well flipper. They don't need those finger bones anymore, but yet they're still there. A third type of anatomical structures are analogous, and these are the ones that students often struggle with. Now, homologous structures are similar, and analogous structures are similar. The difference is why. Why are they similar? So we saw that with homologous, they're similar because there's a relationship. They are related. Analogous are the same due to function or environmental pressure. So these do not show relatedness. If we're trying to look at 2 organisms being related to each other, we're going to be studying homologous structures. But analogous structures provide evidence for a process known as convergent evolution, and we'll take a look at that in a future lesson. But essentially, you can have organisms that look a lot alike, but aren't actually related at all. And the reason they may look alike is because they have evolved in response to similar conditions, to similar pressures, or they're using that for the same purpose, okay? So an example of that is just wings in general. All wings are built for flight, and so the structure of wings may be similar, even though 2 organisms that have wings may not be directly related to each other. You also see that like with camouflage. If you were in a desert, many of the organisms are a tan color. Well, it's not because they're related to each other, it's because they're all adapting to the colors of the sand. And then a third thing that we can, or a fourth type of thing that we can study for anatomy is embryology. So when we look at the development of those embryos from zygote on up, we can see similarities in embryology. So there's a lot of different types of anatomical evidence. These here are an example of homologous structures. You can see that those bone patterns are similar. Now, that turtle leg does not do the same thing as the dolphin fin, and that does not do the same thing as the human arm, and that does not do the same thing as the horse leg. And so even though these structures are very, very similar, they don't have the same function. And so the similarity in their structure, the bone structure, would be homologous. There's got to be some kind of ancestor that all of these came from that had this type of bone structure. Now down here we see analogous structures. So the flipper and the wing and the fin, they do different things, or they do similar things in terms of moving through the water. They're all kind of streamlined for swimming. If you looked at the body shapes of these guys, like when the penguin is swimming through the water, they all kind of have that narrow front. All of these things are going to help them move through the water better. So even though they may not be directly related, we have a bird, a fish, and a mammal. Because they're using them for a similar purpose, we see similarity in structure. Here's an example of vestigial structures. We have these bones in a whale for the hind limbs, and there's bones in the snake for the hind limbs, but yet those limbs don't exist. And then here's an example of studying the embryos. A lot of times early on it's hard to tell what's what, but as they kind of move through their development, you start to see that specialization. But at the beginning it's kind of hard to tell what's a human, what's a turtle. All right, another form of evidence is biogeography, and this is where we look at organism distribution across the globe. We know that the position of our continents have changed over time due to plate tectonics. We know that at one time there was probably a supercontinent known as Pangaea, and so we can look at how organisms and fossils are distributed. Like, why would we see today these remains similar when now there's an ocean in between them? That would suggest that at one point they were connected to each other. Or why do you only find marsupials in Australia and then placentals on the mainland? Just looking at how organisms are distributed both in the fossil record and currently can help us understand these relationships. And then the last form of evidence is going to be molecular evidence. And anytime we're talking about molecular, we're talking about those important molecules of DNA, RNA, and proteins. We can look at DNA sequences, RNA sequences, or amino acid sequences. And this is where a lot of our studies are focused today. Obviously, Darwin and Wallace did not have this type of evidence available to them. You know, we didn't know the structure of DNA until the 1950s, and Darwin was back in the 1800s. So this is a more modern form of evolutionary study. And it continues to grow and develop in the fields today. And essentially what we look at are similarities in these sequences. And the more similar they are, the closer the ancestor. The more different they are, the further the ancestor. And so this molecular data can also help support the relationships that we see in the fossils or that we see in anatomy. It can help us determine how closely related two organisms are. And that is going to wrap up our first lesson on ecology. We're going to do some activities to help review over these, and you will have a quiz over this set of notes. It'll be coming up in the future. Hope you guys enjoyed the ecology project. I'm going to be picking those up soon to grade, and I hope you enjoy this evolution unit with more to come in the future. If you guys have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out, and I hope to see you soon.